We never get tired. We keep moving forward. And sometimes, forward leads you right into the heart of history. It was supposed to be just another day in the Apostolic Palace. But on that morning, the silence was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. The kind of silence that only falls when something irreversible has just happened. Inside the grand marble halls of the Vatican, 200 dignitaries from cardinals to African diplomats held their breath in unison. Why? Because the Pope had just asked a question so simple, yet so loaded. It cracked open centuries of tension, faith, and forgotten truths. He had turned to the young African captain, standing across from him, and asked, "Do you know Jesus Christ?" But to understand why that moment froze time, you have to go back to where it all began. It was March 2024. A sealed envelope arrived at the revolutionary government's headquarters in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Elegant, white, marked with the seal of the Holy See. Inside, a personal invitation. Pope Leo XIV, fictional successor to Pope Francis, was inviting Captain Ibrahim Traoré to the Vatican. Not for protocol, not for photo ops, but for a public conversation. The official Vatican statement was vague, but loaded. His Holiness wishes to engage in meaningful dialogue about faith, governance, and the future of Africa. The room fell quiet when Traoré read the message. Some of his advisors warned, "This is a trap, a political ambush disguised as religion." Others leaned forward, "This is our moment, our story, told on their stage." Traoré tilted his red beret back slightly, scanning the invitation. Then, with the hint of a smirk, he said, "The Pope wants to meet me. Then, let's see what this representative of European Christianity wants from a soldier of Africa." None of them, neither his team nor the Vatican, could have imagined what would happen next, because what started as a meeting would become a reckoning, and a question meant to define one man's faith would end up redefining the soul of a global church. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the Solaria Hall of the Vatican, it was as if time slowed. The golden dome above him had seen centuries of power popes crowned, kings anointed, empires consecrated. But today, it bore witness to something different, something no one could predict. A revolutionary from West Africa had come not to kneel, but to speak. The atmosphere inside the hall was electric. Cardinals whispered behind sleeves. Reporters from every global network adjusted their lenses. Diplomats shifted in their seats. Traoré walked alone. No aides, no speech, only a calm presence, a military uniform, and that red beret tilted with quiet defiance. Across the room sat Pope Leo XIV, a man of peace. Yes, but also a man of memory. He'd spent a lifetime calling for justice in war-torn corners of the world. But even he knew this meeting was different. They sat. No podium, no protocol, just two men, two convictions, and the world watching. The Pope began with grace. "Captain Traoré," he said, "we gather not as symbols of systems, but as children of God. Our world is hurting. Perhaps together, faith and courage can offer a way forward, a respectful opening." But Traoré didn't blink. His voice was calm but steady like stone. "Your Holiness, I appreciate your welcome, but I must speak from truth. I come from a land where missionaries came with crosses and soldiers behind them. We were taught of heaven, while our earth was being taken. And when we rose to resist, we were told to forgive. The silence was deafening. Even the cameras paused. Forgiveness is sacred. Traoré continue. But when it's demanded by those still holding the whip, it feels less like grace and more like control. Gasps swept through the room, but he wasn't finished. My generation was raised in churches built on stolen soil. We sang hymns beside graves no one speaks of. So no. Your Holiness, my faith does not come gently. It comes through fire, through blood, through memory. The Pope didn't interrupt. He listened. There were no security alarms, no walkouts, only the sound of a truth the Vatican hadn't heard spoken this boldly in centuries. And then, quietly, almost gently, Pope Leo leaned forward, his eyes searching. "Captain Traoré," he asked, voice almost a whisper, "do you know Jesus Christ?" And in that moment, history held its breath. For a moment, the entire world stood still. "Do you know Jesus Christ?" The Pope's words still lingered in the air, like smoke from a sacred fire. The question had been asked in humility, not as a test, but as a reaching hand. And yet, it echoed like thunder. Cameras zoomed in. Advisors froze. Even the cardinals didn't breathe. All eyes turned to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He sat back, arms resting on the polished table. His gaze never left the Pope's. No anger, no smugness. Just a man who had lived the question before it was ever spoken. He let the silence stretch long enough for every soul in that room to feel the weight of history pressing down. Then, finally, he stood. No microphone, no teleprompter, just his voice grounded and clear. "You ask if I know Jesus," he said, slowly. "Let me tell you about the Jesus I know." His words didn't rise in volume. But in truth, the Jesus I know wasn't a painting in a European cathedral. He wasn't the face that blessed the ships which chained my ancestors. He wasn't used to silence the oppressed with verses torn from their context. Now you could hear it, the shifting in seats, the discomfort, the awe. "The Jesus I know," he continued, "was a rebel from the global south. He stood against empire. He flipped tables in temples built on exploitation. He walked barefoot with the poor, spoke truth to power, and was killed because he dared challenge the status quo." The Pope's expression shifted: surprise, reflection, maybe even reverence. But Traoré wasn't finished. "The Jesus I know," he said, voice steady. "I didn't ask for worship." He demanded justice. He said the last would be first. He didn't build empires. He broke them. Then came the blow no one expected. "You asked if I know Jesus," he said, turning toward the assembled clergy. "But I ask you, Your Holiness, does your church know him?" A collective gasp. Not from arrogance, not from blasphemy, but from the raw power of a truth no one dared to say aloud. And in that sacred stillness, something began to shift. Not in the politics of the room, but in its spirit. The words hung in the air like smoke from an ancient altar. "Does your church know him?" No one moved. The marble chamber of the Solaria, designed to echo voices, now carried only silence. Even the cameras, still rolling, and felt like intruders. Pope Leo XIV stood frozen for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. Eyes not on Traoré, but on the painted ceiling high above. Saints, angels, and prophets stared back at him, and then, slowly, he lowered his gaze. He looked directly at Traoré, and he nodded. Not out of surrender, but out of recognition. Captain, he said softly. Your words, they cut deep. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror. He stepped forward. Just once. His voice grew firmer age, no longer softening his conviction. For too long. The Pope continued. We have presented the world with a comfortable Jesus. A quiet Jesus. A Jesus who does not disrupt. But that is not the Jesus of the Gospels. Eyes widened around the chamber. The true Jesus, he said, flipped tables, touched lepers, dined with the outcast, and condemned those who clothed themselves in religion but abandoned compassion. And yes, he was executed by the empire, like many truth-tellers after him. Now, the shift began. The tension so thick before was melting, not into agreement, but into something deeper understanding. You ask if the Church knows Jesus, the Pope said, and I must confess, sometimes we have lost sight of him, in our comfort, in our gold, in our silence. That admission sent ripples through the hall. Some cardinals looked away. Others stared, stunned. But among the younger theologians, tears welled up. Something sacred was unfolding. But today, the Pope continued, turning to the full chamber, I was reminded. He looked back to Traoré. You didn't come here to destroy. You came here to remind, to awaken a church that too often forgets the poor carpenter from Nazareth who flipped a world upside down. Then, without cue or ceremony, he stepped forward and extended his hand. Not in diplomacy, but in brotherhood, Captain, he said. I came here thinking I would preach to you, but instead, you've preached to me. A stunned silence, then one clap, then another. Then the chamber rose. It was no longer a meeting. It was a moment. What followed was not written in any protocol. There were no trumpets, no scripted applause, only raw, unfiltered energy pulsing through the room. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré gripped the Pope's hand, a wave of emotion swept over the chamber. Some dignitaries stood in reverence. Others wiped tears they didn't expect to shed. And somewhere in the back, behind a row of Vatican advisors, a young African seminarian whispered, "History just changed." Outside, the news broke in real time. Breaking Pope Leo XIV and Captain Traoré exchange unprecedented words on Jesus and justice. Headlines lit up across continents. Live streams exploded with millions of viewers. Clips flooded TikTok, Twitter, and WhatsApp. But it wasn't the handshake that went viral. It was the question. Does your church know him? And the response. Sometimes we've lost sight of him. Theologians, pastors, students, and everyday believers began debating what they had just witnessed. Progressive circles hailed the moment as a theological breakthrough, a reckoning centuries in the making. Conservative circles trembled at the implications. Was the Pope endorsing revolution? Was the Church admitting guilt? But beyond the politics, something deeper stirred in the hearts of everyday people. In Lagos, a Catholic priest rewrote his Sunday sermon overnight. In São Paulo, liberation theologians organized a vigil titled "The Jesus We Forgot." In Kinshasa, a teenage girl posted a hand-drawn sketch of Jesus, not in robes of gold, but barefoot, surrounded by the poor. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré returned to a hero's welcome. But when asked what he felt standing in the Vatican that day, he said simply, "I didn't go to confront. I went to testify." Jesus was Africa's first revolutionary. The question isn't whether we should abandon Christianity. It's whether we have the courage to reclaim it. And at the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV wasn't done. He called an emergency synod. He launched a sweeping internal audit of church wealth. He proposed the creation of a permanent council for justice and liberation theology with African, Asian, and Latin American theologians. At its core, the church was moving. But perhaps the most powerful shift wasn't institutional. It was personal, because that day, two men from opposite worlds didn't just shake hands. They touched the soul of a global faith and forced it to ask, not who Jesus was, but whether we still recognize him at all. What began as a conversation was now becoming a movement. Within weeks of the historic Vatican encounter, the ripple effects could no longer be contained. In seminaries across Africa, dusty textbooks were replaced with new curricula. For the first time, liberation theology, once whispered on the margins, was now front and center. Professors rewrote syllabi. Students flooded lecture halls. Debates broke out, not about doctrine, but about action. What does it mean to follow a Jesus who stood with the poor? How should a church serve in nations still healing from exploitation? Could faith be a weapon of liberation, not submission? The questions spread like wildfire. In Ghana, youth pastors preached sermons titled "Reclaiming Jesus from Empire." In Brazil, a slum church painted a new mural, not of a pale, distant Christ, but of a brown-skinned Jesus, kneeling beside a mother, holding a starving child. In Manila, Nairobi, and Port-au-Prince, underground Bible studies emerged, all echoing one truth: the gospel is not about comfort. It's about courage. But the transformation wasn't just in churches. Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV took bold, tangible steps. He ordered an independent review of Vatican assets, one that traced funds back to colonial exploitation. He redirected millions toward development programs in the Global South: education, clean water, and land restoration. He created a permanent dialogue office between the Vatican and emerging nations, led not by cardinals, but by theologians, farmers, women, and poets. And at the heart of it all, a phrase had taken root in every corridor: "Does your church know him?" It had become more than a question. It was a mirror, a challenge, a quiet revolution of conscience. Captain Traoré, meanwhile, continued his work in Burkina Faso, not as a prophet, but as a public servant. He rarely spoke of the Vatican meeting again, but when asked what he believed had truly shifted that day, he replied, "Power didn't change hands, but something deeper did. A truth was spoken, and this time, it wasn't ignored." That's the thing about truth when it's finally heard. It doesn't just sit quietly. It grows. It convicts. It transforms. And now, from Vatican halls to village churches, the world was starting to remember the face of a Jesus long buried beneath gold and silence. By the time the spring rains returned to Burkina Faso, the world had already shifted. What started as a bold exchange between two men had now become a lens away for millions to re-examine their faith, their identity, and their history. And at the center of it all was a question whispered in languages across continents. Do we still know him? In Dakar, a 19-year-old theology student named Fatoumata Diallo published a blog post titled, "The Revolutionary Jesus and Me." It went viral within days. For the first time, she wrote, "I see Jesus not as someone who came to make me silent, but someone who came to make me stand." Her words inspired a generation. Church youth groups across the global South began launching campaigns under a new banner, Jesus of Justice. And this time, it wasn't about protest. It was about purpose. In Johannesburg, a network of pastors drafted a declaration demanding their seminaries be restructured around grassroots theology. In Haiti, survivors of political violence gathered for healing retreats, reading the Gospels not for guilt, but for grit. Even in Western countries, the impact was felt. In a quiet corner of New York City, a retired Jesuit professor admitted in a radio interview, "All my life, I taught Christ as a doctrine, but maybe I never really introduced him as a disruptor." But not everyone was ready. Some high-ranking Vatican officials pushed back, calling the movement emotionally charged and theologically dangerous. They feared it would fragment the unity of the Church. Yet Pope Leo XIV stood firm. He reminded them that unity built on silence was not unity, but stagnation. And quietly, behind closed doors, he began drafting something bold, a new encyclical. Its working title, Ecclesia et Liberatio, the Church and Liberation. It would become his most controversial, most powerful work. Meanwhile, Captain Traoré, ever silent, ever grounded, declined multiple interview requests. But when a young reporter asked him if he saw himself as a religious leader now, he smiled. "No," he said, "I'm just a man who was asked a question, and I chose to answer it with my whole truth." And that was the very thing that made the world listen. By summer's end, the Vatican had become restless. Behind the gilded doors and stained glass windows, something ancient was stirring. Not scandal, not politics, but conscience. When Pope Leo XIV released his long-awaited encyclical Ecclesia et Liberatio, it wasn't just a document, it was a thunderclap. Across 87 pages, written in crisp, deliberate Latin, and translated instantly into over 70 languages, the Pope outlined a bold vision, a church that walks with the oppressed, not above them. A faith that repents its history and rebuilds through justice, a commitment to redistribute church resources toward poverty-stricken communities in the global South. But it was the dedication page that struck deepest, to the voices we failed to hear, to the Jesus we forgot. It was the first encyclical in modern church history to directly reference colonization, institutional silence, and the failure to act. And though no names were mentioned, everyone knew whose voice had cracked open that door. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's Vatican visit was now being studied in seminaries across 5 continents. Philosophy students called it the encounter. Liberation theologians called it the Second Reformation. But to the poor, to the hungry, to the ignored, it was simply called the day someone finally said what we've always felt. And the impact, it was more than spiritual. In Malawi, a local bishop auctioned off half of his diocese's gold ornaments to fund clean water systems. In Bolivia, Catholic universities began teaching African and indigenous theology side by side with European texts. In South Korea, Catholic nuns marched with single mothers demanding wage reform. And in Rome, the Pope quietly ordered that a new mosaic be added to a small chapel near the Apostolic Palace. It showed Christ barefoot, brown-skinned, kneeling in a dusty street, one hand stretched toward a starving child, the other flipping over a table of gold. It was unlike any image ever sanctioned by the Vatican, but the Pope only smiled when asked why. Because, he said, this is the Jesus the world is finally ready to see. The echoes of that mosaic reached far beyond those walls, because when a revolution of faith is born not in violence, but in truth, it doesn't just change institutions. It changes hearts. By the time autumn leaves began to fall across Europe and Africa, the world had already entered a new spiritual season. It wasn't declared by edicts. It wasn't enforced by clergy. It arrived quietly, like truth often does. Not from the pulpits, but from the people. In Kenya, barefoot children gathered beneath a mango tree, listening to their teacher read the Sermon on the Mount, not as metaphor, but as a mission. Blessed are the poor in spirit, she whispered, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In Haiti, earthquake survivors painted murals of a Christ who wept beside their broken homes. In India, a group of Dalit Christians wrote a new hymn titled, We Saw Him Among Us. And in the dusty village of Koudougou, Burkina Faso, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré was born, an old woman knelt in prayer at dawn. She didn't pray for power. She didn't ask for riches. She prayed that her grandchildren would grow up, knowing the Jesus who stood for them, not just died for them. Meanwhile, across Vatican halls, even the most hardened bishops had begun to shift. Some retired quietly. Others, humbled, requested missions to underserved regions, seeking to walk what they once only preached. And Pope Leo XIV, he appeared less in public now, not out of retreat, but reflection. In one of his final televised addresses of the year, he stood before a simple wooden cross, not gold, not jewel-encrusted, and said, The question still echoes in my soul. Does your church know him, I pray? We are learning. And in that moment, people weren't listening to a pope. They were listening to a man flawed, aging, human, who had dared to admit that even the greatest institutions can forget and still choose to remember. As for Captain Traoré, he returned to his quiet leadership, visiting farmers, building wells, rewriting textbooks for schools in forgotten towns. He no longer needed microphones, because his answer had already become a movement, one rooted not in rebellion, but in return, a return to the Jesus who stood with the broken, flipped the tables of the greedy, and whispered into history's ear, The last shall be first. And slowly, across nations, people began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant it.